Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. I'm Patty Fay. This podcast is for physicians or anyone who thinks healthcare needs a transformation led by physicians. License to Lead means that physicians are charged with and must be in charge of guiding the vision and the culture of healthcare systems. Today, I'm talking with my friend, Dr. Jandel Allen-Davis. Jandel is an obstetrician and gynecologist who practiced with the Colorado Permanente Medical Group, which is where we met. In addition to being an outstanding and beloved physician, her career has included one leadership role after another. She was on the executive teams of both Kaiser and Permanente, first on the medical group, and then she took on a vice president role with Kaiser Foundation Health Plan. She led government relations and research and advertising and marketing. 2 years ago, she became the president and CEO of Craig Hospital. Craig's a jewel in the crown of healthcare organizations in Colorado, a renowned rehab center for patients who have traumatic brain injuries and spinal cord injuries. I asked Jandel for this interview because, well, she's amazing. A physician leader whose story includes triumph over a very difficult childhood, education at Dartmouth, where she met her beloved, 4 years with the Indian Health Service. Jandel lived and worked as a physician on a reservation in Arizona. I think that's where she learned to quilt, and now she's a nationally known fiber artist. And I'm not even kidding. We'll put some links to her art in the show notes. Accolades have been showered on Jandel for her advocacy and leadership work. She's a physician leader, a photographer, a mom, a wife, a female CEO, and a Black woman changing how people think. Jandel, welcome. Thank you for joining me. I know you've dealt with all the upheavals of 2020 that have continued into 2021. I know you just got part 2 of your vaccine yesterday, and now here you are recording a podcast with me on a Saturday morning. How are you feeling?
Oh, I'm feeling great, Patty. At the moment, I'll call it better living through chemistry. How about that? Nothing that a little Tylenol won't take care of. And thank you again for allowing me the opportunity to come have this conversation with you. This should be fun.
Let's start out by talking about your role as the CEO at Craig. You're the first female leader at Craig and the first Black leader at Craig and the first physician leader there in about 40 years. Talk to us about how you made the decision to take on the Craig Hospital CEO role.
Patty, if it were that organized, right, in terms of what we end up doing, that is that I, quote, made the decision. Ultimately, I obviously made the decision, but it all started with a call from a recruiter. I will say somewhat embarrassingly, I knew very little about Craig, even though their CEO at the time, Mike Fordyce, and I had served on chamber board things and knew each other from around town. And so I gave him names of a couple of folks who I knew, who I think just the world of, and hung up the phone. And then a friend who knew that I was ready to move on. I was beginning to feel hemmed in. I was feeling as if there was more I wanted to do, more I needed to do than I thought was going to be possible at Kaiser Permanente. So she sent me this email, or text rather, and I tell people she yelled at me in a text. I think in my mind it feels like it was in all caps, but she yelled at me and said, "He's going to call you back. You know you're ready to do something more. You may not get this role, but you have to try." It's like, oh, please don't make me do that. Because as you and I know, I had gotten on the horse and had applied for the regional president role at KP just a couple of years before. And, you get those disappointments. And I called that period the disappointment with a capital T and a capital D are tough, but you learn a ton about yourself through them. So I did agree to meet with the recruiter. And as I learned more about Craig, and the word that he kept talking about was the culture, I said, I'm intrigued. And 2 years and 4 months later, here I am, I'd say in ways, despite all we've been through, the time of my life in terms of this role, working in this amazing and marvelous place, and never, ever would have seen it coming. So I don't know about decide. I think the universe, what I told folks in the interview, actually, Patty, was you don't find these roles find you.
I'm intrigued with what you said about the disappointment. I see that in bold and caps as a chapter headline, maybe. Can you say more about that? What was that like for you?
Yeah. So I'll tell you a little story and then back up. I was going out. I had to go out twice to Oakland, where all the mothership is for Kaiser Permanente, and interview with all sorts of senior vice presidents out there, as well as the CEO and president now, the late Bernard Tyson. And I had to go out twice, and so I was on the plane, and you get bored. I opened my iPad and went to Kindle to see, and I said, "Oh, what's this book?" And it was one that I had pre-ordered. Brene Brown's book, Rising Strong, is what it was. And I went, "Ooh, I don't even remember putting this in here." But it was, if you dare greatly and often enough, you will fall down. This is a book about getting up. And the interesting thing that I remember was going through this thing, and actually, I'll say, competing with two other people on the leadership team at Kaiser. And one of whom is a really good friend, still is a good friend, Roland Lyon. And I remember us going out to dinner early in this time together and saying, "If you get it, I'll be okay." And him saying, "If you get it, I'll be okay." And when you're competing for whatever it is you're competing, only one person is going to get it. So you have to be thinking about, you almost have to process on two levels. One, you got to swing for the fence. You got to put your all into it. And at the same time, you have to be preparing for, you might not get the role. And what are you going to do if you don't? And what I told myself is that you are going to feel every bit of the disappointment, but you're going to put your big girl panties on and go back to work. And that was a Friday. And Monday, I went back to work where Roland was announced. And I said to my team, who I went back to doing my day job, as it were, is we cannot let Roland fail. I'd be lying if I said that it wasn't a hard time. But I think one of the most important things we can do is be pros. I mean, and frankly, if we think about what we as physicians have to do every day around some much more profound disappointments that our patients face, you'll be fine. You'll be fine. And the thing I wouldn't allow myself to do, even though I knew people would say it, is, "Oh, it's because something greater is happening, or it was meant to be." It's like, no, that's got you looking forward. You need to feel every second of this because it's critical for growth.
Well, thank you for walking through that and sharing that. I think that's so important. And there's something so big in there about you being very purposeful about then turning around and supporting your friend who did get the top job and who you were reporting to at that point. So then a couple years later, you ended up as the CEO and president of Craig Hospital. There must have been something that grabbed you when you walked in those doors. It must have been something about the culture that you noticed. What showed up for you?
As I said, I'd hear time and again about the culture, and it's something that's even talked about now at Craig. It's one of the things that we guard with a little bit of hyperbole to say our lives, but certainly guard with our careers in terms of being incredibly mission and purpose-focused, and also family and patient-centered in a way that I've never seen. In fact, I remember, Patty, the first-round interviews, which weren't at Craig. They were off-site somewhere. And I think it was like a Tuesday or Wednesday morning I had to do this thing. And Sunday, I was in our laundry room, and I said, "You have to go in here in a few days and tell them why you want this job." I realized that what grabbed me about this job is that these were people, men and women, who had suffered devastating injuries, whether self-imposed in some way due to some behaviors or at work, or as about half of the folks who end up there are motor vehicle accidents. And what I realized in that instance is, we cease to see people with brain injuries and folks who end up in wheelchairs. There's this way that they're marginalized. But these were people who woke up with one reality and went to bed with a different one. And I said, it's tapping into my warrior for the vulnerable spirit. That is one thing for sure that got me right away, was this idea of, it embarrassed me in a sense to think that, gosh, you do that too. So it was a sort of unpacking a bias that I didn't even realize I really had. And the bias was this discomfort around people in wheelchairs or people with brain injuries, and not really knowing how to step into the conversation. And when I walked into the hospital, I had the opportunity to meet one of the receptionists, one of the guys who sits at the front desk, Adam. And Adam had a smile on his face, and he said hello, and then the CEO came down, and I had a chance just for a few minutes to stand there in this waiting room that had, I'd say, the right lighting, I'll say now, in terms of what I know about brain injury and overstimulation. Our outpatient department is right there. I had trouble telling patients from staff, because the families had said apparently some years ago that they wanted us to dress like them. They didn't want it to have a hospital feel, given how long these stays are there. And I just noticed everybody was so friendly. When Mike came down, there he was, kiboshing it up and, sort of joshing with a couple of the patients who were there for their visits. And I just went, Patty, I said, I'm home. I'm home. Wow. And then I looked up at the heavens and said, please, God, let it be. And it happened. So,
and you were home.
I was home. It felt familiar in a relaxed way, a not buttoned up way, a place where I could bring my whole self in and not feel embarrassed or awkward. There's nothing buttoned up about Craig. And in fact, after this all happened, people said, we knew you were one of the people because nobody wears a black suit and a white shirt around there. So I stuck out like a sore thumb for more reasons than just my skin tone. So.
What else do you think it was, Jandel, that made the people who interviewed you realize you were the right person for the job?
So I think, and you sort of alluded to it, there is, despite 11-ish years ago, walking away from all clinical care or direct bedside care, there is nothing that I've done in my life, including this job, that meant more to me than caring for patients. That ability to establish, or the need, I think, for good docs to establish instant trust. Or people take for granted that you know your stuff, so that's a sacred trust, so you better know your stuff. The relatability, I think the relatability factor is one of the things that I saw. I think they appreciate, and we do appreciate, the right doses of humor. The ability, I said some years ago, I'd say to the leadership team from time to time when I felt courageous enough sitting at KP, I'd say, team, our people, those we serve, want to be seen and see us. So I knew, and I had the sense that I could just be me. In fact, there was a point in one of the interviews, and I'd had a chance to walk around the hospital the first hour that I was there on that first day and just see the hospital and watch how Mike related and talked to patients. And I said, gosh, he not only knows everybody's names, but he knows their stories, because I saw how he checked in with a couple of people. I said, oh, I love this place. I love this. I could thrive here. And there came a point on the second day, I think it was, where somebody asked me a question. So you get this job. Let's say you get this job. What is Craig going to be like 2 years from now with you as at the helm? And I said to the group, I think it was a group, some of the directors of the hospital, I said, I know no other way to be but me. And, I'd had a chance to walk around with Mike and could see how he related and connected to people. And, I'm pretty straight up in terms of how I talk about things. I said, I think if you hire me, you're going to be getting the black female Mike Fordyce.
Really?
And we cracked up in the room. And I think, so that relatability, the ability just to be authentic, they like. And I think, the way, I assume no one told me, but that recognition that people in those wheelchairs want to be able to see us and be seen by us, because they are just men and women who, had a horrible day. In a split second, your life can change. And funny thing is, within about a week or two, I stopped seeing wheelchairs and only saw people. These folks in wheelchairs want nothing more, because we've all had that experience of feeling different. And they want nothing more than for you to see them as whole, even in their broken bodies. And they want nothing more than us to be there to provide the kind of reassurance, the kind of confidence, the kind of belief in them, and the amazing expertise of these pros, these professionals, that's going to help them learn to live alongside this injury in some way. In fact, you'll hear around Craig from time to time, I do everything I used to do, I just do it differently. And that's from patients. So I think they aren't that different. And I quickly got comfortable with that. And I do think, honestly, Patty, it helps that I'm a physician. We never knew when we knocked on doors of new patients, used to be take the chart off the door, whatever it was. You never knew who or what was on the other side of that door, what story, what fear, what concern, what wonderment, what puzzle waited on the other side of that door. And what our patients wanted more than anything else was to know that you were going to hang with them no matter what. And I think it's the same with our patients with these disabilities or these differently abled bodies.
Right. It's be with people who have differences from us, be with them and ask the questions, have the conversations.
It's funny you say that because they are anxious to talk about it. I thought, can we ask what happened? It's like most of the time you don't even have to say what happened. They are anxious to tell their story. I think it's part of just the therapeutic process in terms of their own healing, but it's also that they want you to know that they're normal, that they are whole living beings who had, and I'm talking some devastating and sometimes some stories that just bring you to your knees in terms of how people are injured. They don't want us to see them as broken or different, so. And frankly, that's what all of us want. I had no concept of color as a little kid. I don't think little kids do. And I could sense from white people this kind of thing coming at me. And I wanted to scream, white people, I'm different. I remember feeling that way as a second grader. I wanted to be seen as Jandel, this little kid who did whatever little kids do. And I think the same goes for all of us.
I want to follow up on what you said about just wanting to tell white folks, I'm Jandel. And what was that message? What was inside you when this happened, when it was clear you were being seen as different?
I wasn't only being seen. I know the language now, and I think I knew it then, but didn't know it then. I was saying that we view Black people, and I'm going to say that, not just Latino or Hispanic, but we view African Americans or Africans, people with this skin, with this history, as the lowest rung in the society. And we channel that in America without even really channeling it. We incorporate that into our DNA, and I believe it's cellular. What's gone on since last summer has been, we talk about an awakening, and people, to use the vernacular, folk are woke. Well, Black folk are woke too, in some ways, both in terms of it is time to figure out how to walk into this morass of race in a different way than we have before. But to spend my whole life proving myself as worthy of opportunity, worthy of respect, and not even knowing that's what I've been doing. And I'll tell you, it's exhausting. And then the other thing that's interesting about it, as you said, I trained at Dartmouth, and I can remember, so this is the early 80s, and there weren't many women around, if you remember. It's kind of hard to believe that even in terms of women in medicine, it's a relatively modern thing in terms of now half, I think, the number of docs are female. That's just happened in these last 40 or so years. But in the early 80s, weren't many of us around, even in our class at Dartmouth. And I can remember watching these stiff, starch, perfectly coated white older men. You could see them sizing you up. You could almost like see them trying to figure out where and what sort of box to put you in. And then once I started talking, you can also, and with some, not with all, but with many back then, sort of having their notions, their beliefs challenged by who was standing in front of them. Because, going to Dartmouth back then, you had to have been an affirmative action case. You took a seat, I can say all the cynical things. You took a seat from a white male, and I mean it, white and male, especially at Dartmouth, because Dartmouth was the last of the Ivies to even go co-ed,
really?
Which was they graduated their first class of women in 1976. And that's the year I started at college there. So, you could see people trying to and then what they do is they say you're different. They don't say it, but you watch them sort of size things up and says, oh, she's actually a medical student who seems to know, she studied, she's smart, she's whatever they're thinking. I don't know. I never asked, but you could certainly feel it. It's palpable that way.
It's crushing.
It's a sad thing to have to sort of recognize. So I had my own awakening this summer when I realized in reading this book, Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, that I have been walking around for most of these 63 years, whatever, sort of a coming of age and awareness, with this knowledge that I was less than, that I was at the bottom of the caste system without ever really saying it. And hit me as if someone had smacked me upside the head with a brick. And so I've been processing that and trying to figure out what are those tapes, or not even what, I don't have to figure them out, I know what they are. What are the tapes you tell yourself that simply aren't true? And what's the impact on you in terms of carrying that as a burden on your soul? And it can be exhausting.
After reading Caste, you realized you had been walking around knowing that you were in the lowest caste, knowing that you were less than, like it was in your bones. What have you learned emerging from that?
The thing that happened this summer after Mr. Floyd's murder and the protests that happened in the street that were so different than the ones in the 60s and even times before then in terms of the number of white folk who were like over it too, was this interesting awakening. I remember I'd have conversations with folks in the hall because there'd be people who wanted to talk about this. And I remember this woman saying to me in the parking garage, like with a sense of shock, like I had the same kind of shock, but in a bit different way. And she said, I never walk around thinking that I'm white. I never walk around thinking about the fact that I'm white.
So this was a white woman.
Oh, I'm sorry. This was a white woman. I should have said that. I never think about that. And then I didn't say anything back in terms of what I thought, but my what came to mind instantly was, and I always walk around well aware of the fact that I'm Black. And, I don't wear it. I always say there's no chips on these shoulders. They're as smooth as can be, but I'm also not blind to the fact that I know that this is a privilege to get to do what I do every day. And I also know that we're wasting a hell of a lot of talent out there because despite what people may say in terms of your unusualness, Jandel, I think there's a whole lot of Jandels out there who are sitting there just saying, put me in, coach, give me a shot. And they're saying it from like little kids who, are sort of pigeonholed, whether it's what we do with Black boys or, other folks who are different and do it subconsciously on some level. So I think that's the awakening that we're in, and I sure hope we can keep shaking ourselves and not allow ourselves to fall back asleep.
I've heard you say that it's been a reckoning for white people and Black people. And can you say more about the reckoning for Black people after the George Floyd murder?
Yeah, and I can speak somewhat for myself, and I think that's one of the things that what was so uncomfortable in those, I will honestly tell you, in those early weeks after Mr. Floyd's killing was, in fact, I remember looking up at the heavens at one point and going, really, God? Really? You put me here in the middle of a pandemic, and now we're doing this reckoning with race, and I'm this little Black person who white folks were trying to figure out, oh my gosh. And one of the things that was so much a part of those early days as we were all trying to sort of wrap our heads around the emotion and the emotions was people would say, I'm sorry. And they'd say, oh, how are you doing? How are you doing? And I'd either get emails or calls or folks around the hospital. And I realized in that instant that it made me really uncomfortable that people were apologizing. And it took me a moment to figure out, why does this make you uncomfortable? I said, oh, because it implies separateness. I mean, the bottom line is this is a shared experience. Every single thing that's happened in America since the first of whoever stepped foot on the soil of this continent, we're all part of whatever what it is, wherever you go, there you are kind of thing. And that separateness sort of makes it sound as if it's my problem to solve. It's our problem to solve. It's sort of a little bit, and this is ever so cynical, but true. Like when somebody dies or loses a loved one, we do oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. And it's like, because it's your loss, not mine. And it's not callous, but it's this thing that's yours to solve too. And the epiphany I had in that instance is like, no, this is all of ours. You are just as much in the muck as I am. I'm just swimming in it a little bit more deeply than you are because of, all the obvious reasons. So it's just been troubling, and yet it was a really, I think, important recognition that we are all needing to take this walk together. And as long as we say, Allen-Davis, you solve it. In fact, some of the things I heard right after it from African Americans who I absolutely respect and love is, but I didn't create it. So I can't do it alone, right? At the same time, we can't say, you all call me when you figure it all out, is that we've got to step into this one together and figure out a different way forward. And a lot of that involves reflecting back on what we've done heretofore to try to do things. And that, we shouldn't take away at the same time from what we have accomplished. I mean, good grief, look what I get to do. Look what I get to do. Mm-hmm. But yet there's more. There's so much more that needs to be done because of all the wasted potential, let alone the literal loss of life that's happening in our communities, either due to disease, let alone violence, and the other loss of, the opportunity for grand and good educations, and on and on and on and on.
Oh, so many losses, so much pain, and I think it's such an important and such a difficult conversation. And you're so right. You're carrying something in your bones, and I'm carrying something in my bones. It's the ugly, ugly burden, and pain is certainly in the Black community or on the Black community. And it's also very much in the white community, and what we watch, what we spectate, and what we take for granted as with white privilege.
I think it's a dose of forgiveness, but you can't get to forgiveness until we lose the shame. And there's a crap load of shame and discomfort that's part of this conversation that serves as another point of separation as opposed to just being able to name it. And, even being able to say out loud, which or the way that I talk about it now, which is very different than, I have in times past, to be able to use the racism word and be okay with it, right?
Right.
And not sling it at people as a dagger, or as a word to hurt, but as a recognition that it's real. And now what are we going to do about it? Because we can sit here and you can hang your head in shame. I can hem and haw around the word. I can get angry about the word, and there is some righteous anger. Then absolutely, we all need to get really pissed off about it. But it can't become this thing where we reinforce the separateness because you did this to me, or you're not doing that, or play the what about card, or any of a number of other things, as opposed to saying we're all in this muck together. And if we think for a second that America has anywhere close to a chance of realizing sort of that vision and that dream and the ideals that, a bunch of really messed up men in some ways when you think about what slavery was. If you think that we have any chance of getting to that sort of a dream or ideal without dealing with this, then you're sadly mistaken, is what I'd say. And we have to do the work. You got to do the work. And there's no recipe, because if there was a recipe, we'd have done it by now.
We would have figured it out. I think the use, the acceptance, the understanding that we are a racist society, that I am a racist, that, I have enjoyed white privilege. I think that conversation is a real shift since the George Floyd murder. I think that we see what a huge problem it is, the way the word racism has been used. Well, just the way we recoil, we just run backwards from that word, which keeps us from talking about what it is and what it means.
As you and I both know, we've got a dear former boss and buddy, Dr. Jack Cochran, who I had a really good conversation. I had a couple, because he's one of the people who called me after the Mr. Floyd killing. And I remember sending him an email after and saying, the thing about privilege is it's not something that you should be ashamed of, but can you use it for good? And I said, Jack, that's what you did. You opened doors. You used your power as a very white male, very Irish white male physician with all sorts of status that inured to him, to open doors with a good understanding of there's things that I have to do when I'm afforded the opportunity, that you, Patty, we as women have to do, we as whoever gets the opportunity, but also with an understanding that I have to use that privilege and tell people, she's with me, right? She's with me. And I think that's the difference. It's not to say, oh my God, it's funny. There were a few moments after, just I'll tell you jokingly, I went, it's not a disease, this white privilege thing. There were people who were saying, I have white privilege. It's like, it's not a scourge. It's not a disease. It's really, what do you want to do? It's power. And what can you do with it for good? How do you use it for good is the real thing now that you've awakened to it. And then how do I have to sort of show up in a way that doesn't shame but is absolutely upfront and real about the way that privilege has worked to keep people out. So anyway, lots of unpacking, assuming we don't go back to sleep.
Oh, we can't go back to sleep. That's a fear. So very much to navigate and figure out, and to have the guts to get in there, to not succumb to white fragility and stay away rather than walk into the fire and have the conversation and be part of the movement. I think that's the big lift for white folks, as you call us. Jandel, I would like to tap into your perspectives on physician leadership. And maybe we can start by talking a little bit about your initial impressions of the physicians at Craig. Craig is nationally, if not internationally, known for their superb physicians and the research and the work. Can you talk about your relationship and maybe your initial interview with the physicians there?
Sure. So the CNS, which if you ask them what does it stand for, nobody knows. Nobody knows how it became CNS. Is it central nervous system? Is it Craig Neurological Services? Who knows? But CNS is the name of the group. And there are 9 of the most amazing mission-driven, purpose-filled docs that I've had the opportunity in such a sort of small, intimate setting to work with. And they're just a great group of guys. But I will tell you, as happens, and both because of my walk at KP, let alone certainly you could say even what I brought therefore into Craig, was there's this sort of sense that people who do what I did, which was walk away from medicine after 25 years of caring for women and do pure administration, you've gone to the dark side. That's the language that's used. And it's a pejorative if ever there was one. If we think about what some of the stereotypes around that are, things like, you did that because you weren't a good doc. Well, that ain't true in my case. Or you did that because you don't have the goods, the mental or whatever, the physical toughness to hang in and do clinical. That certainly wasn't the case with me. And we can talk about, so what was it in a moment. But I think just even how I find myself at Craig, it's been doors open and you know which ones you're supposed to walk through. So anyway, I have these interviews that I had referenced a bit ago. And one of them was with the CNS, was with the physician group. And I was so nervous about this interview because one of the things, sadly, I'll just go ahead and admit that I said I never want to do is lead physicians. We are smart people. And I allowed myself to get intimidated by physicians and especially in light of that kind of language that is salvoed against those who want to lead, who dare to lead, who as physicians. But anyway, so I was a little nervous about this interview with the guys. And there's one woman. So 8 guys, 1 woman in this group. We had the best conversation. And as, the time came to go and I stood up and they stood up and we all shook hands. And I said to him, I got to tell you guys, this is the interview I was the most nervous about. And one of them looked at me and said, why? You're one of us. And it was a kind of, oh, well, maybe there's another story here. I remember saying to them, I have a very, very, very strong belief that the only professional who's going to be able to turn healthcare around in this country are physicians. It's got to be led by us. And even if only practically, because we're the ones who order stuff and diagnose stuff and, in terms of the hierarchy, which I hate, but I'll use the language because we know that's what it is. We're at the top of that hierarchy, and how we show up there is going to make the difference between being able to move healthcare along in the United States or not. So I said, I have a strong belief that that's the only way we're going to get out of this is physicians have to lead it.
Boy, I agree with you on that one, Jandel. I have to say, I think it's amazing that the physician group at Craig is CNS. I think that's a good one for the central nervous system. And then the whole idea of going to the dark side is such a profound way that physicians, we shoot ourselves in the foot because that is the lingo. It's the idea that if somebody goes into administration, they're no longer seen as part of the physician society or part of medicine. And I just rail against that. It's so damaging, and it makes it less likely that fantastic physicians are going to raise their hand for leadership because most of us are above all committed to excellent patient care and making sure that patients get what they need. And that can be long after somebody has left a clinical practice. It's still about creating the kind of culture where you can take excellent care of patients and fulfill the obligations and the ethical expectations of being a physician. And how about with the rest of the organization? Do you think the fact that you're a doc has been relevant at all to your other relationships at Craig?
I think so. And interestingly, there have been comments made by the folks who I serve alongside on the leadership team. My being a physician provides an inroad to, or a linkage to the medical group in ways that weren't possible before or were more difficult before. I'll tell you, just like saying you're the black girl who can help us get out of the race things, I don't exactly like the mantle, but it's all part of it, is that to the extent that you think that there's a way that I show up, either as a physician or just as Jandel, that can be helpful and useful in terms of moving a culture along that does need some movement, and not in terms of losing the essence of the culture, but watching the nature of competition change outside of our walls. And then if I can be helpful that way, I'm all about it. I'll tell you, I have so much, honestly, PTSD, and I'll use that language, about my KP experience. Those were tough last few years at KP in terms of watching what was happening with competition outside of our walls and our inability to listen and hear it and figure out what we needed to do to walk through it, some of which is hard. It's not always going to be easy, and change is something that not we all, but there are people who don't want to do or are very resistant. And yet being able to say, I've lived that. I've got that lived experience as a leader in an amazing organization that couldn't figure out how to get out of its own way and really listen and see what was happening around it and figure out then what's our play. I want to be able to help and bring that to Greg, because we are watching a little perception is reality play going on out in the acute rehabilitation and even the post-acute rehabilitation world. And you can't sit back and say, but we're Craig and we're fabulous. It's like, oh no, I heard that at Kaiser. That doesn't always come out super well, guys. We have to figure out how to work alongside and work around this and figure out then how are we going to strategically navigate these waters in a way that doesn't have you lose your soul or lose the heart of what you do or sacrifice quality.
You had mentioned that you noticed credibility with the staff and working with family members and the patients, that being a physician seemed to position you a little bit differently. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, it's funny when we were chatting at night, it was only because of that great conversation we had a few days ago that I realized I think most people assume that healthcare organizations are all led by physicians, and we're not. It just isn't. And I've been thinking about that since then, and also, again, having sort of begun to listen to your first podcast. And you're right, law firms are led by lawyers. Every now and then a university will put a business person in charge. Doesn't work that well. I certainly saw that at Dartmouth. But we go back to saying the people who know what it's like in the classroom, who know what it's like to support students, who know what it's like to watch the wonder of when students get the aha and figure it out. They're the ones, assuming they don't lose sight of that when they move into these roles. They are the ones who can be the voice in an appropriate way of those who teach, who can be, in our case, the voice in an appropriate way of those who serve at the bedside, but also can be the voice for nurses and pharmacists and therapists and all the other people who are part of the clinical journey of any given patient. And it's important that we not lose that and not sort of think, and I've seen this happen where I have to learn to talk the business jargon. When I was going through this search, they said, but I'm not a CFO. It's like, actually, we don't need a CFO in this chair. You sort of think you have to have finance, and actually, turns out finance tells the story of an organization. That's what it tells. You're getting it mixed up with accounting. So look at the numbers. We are curious humans. Doctors are wired for curiosity and wired to want to learn. And there's these things that you can learn, but that's not what you're there to do. And you really are there to make sure, as a doc, that what happens at the bedside doesn't get lost in the muck of either, frankly, any one of the aspects of the triple aim, finance, quality, or that care experience. It has to be all of it. wrapped in. So
some cohesion. Did you ever pursue an MBA?
No. Oops, did I say it? I said it with disdain. Ooh, that was too real. Okay. No, I didn't. And I never wanted to, although there were people who thought, and I saw docs who thought that that was going to be, sort of the holy grail, that if I was going to be able to do these roles, I needed to have an MBA. And I was actually told that by a leader in the Masters of Health Administration program, is that you will never become the leader of a hospital or an organization without an MBA. And, there were a couple of reasons why I didn't, Patty. First of all, the idea of going back to school to do that level of, the rigor. And I was like, when would I fit that in with all the other stuff that's going on? Practically speaking, when would I fit it in? And so, when it was first told me, I did kind of think, oh my God. It's like, don't worry about it. If this isn't your time, you can do it next life. But you're not going to do it this life. And you get to do what you get to do from whatever seat you're in. And that's more than enough. And then when I got the role at Craig, he called me and he says, you proved me wrong.
So this was a professor that you worked with?
Yeah. And actually an old hospital executive, no less, who was not a physician. He says, I always said you needed an MBA. I told you that. And darn if you didn't become a hospital CEO without one. So I don't think it's important. I mean, we don't, any more than we do in clinical medicine, we don't have to have all the parts. We can't play all the roles. I can't be in an operating room when, whether things are going sideways or not. I'm not the anesthesiologist and the circulating nurse and scrub nurse and the surgeon and the med student and. We all have our roles to play, and it's super important that we remember that. And the same goes on teams like this. And I've told my team is that we're a team of equals. I know the role, and I sure get that the buck stops here, and I understand, even though I rail against the icky parts of hierarchy. But the fact is that we all bring the gifts we bring to this work, and you bring the expertise that you bring, and I know pretty well what I think I bring.
I really appreciate what you said, that a lot of families and patients and I guess lay people think that physicians are running most healthcare organizations. And that is absolutely something I've run into with my podcasts. When people listen to them who are not in healthcare, that's probably the number one reaction I get, which is, what? We thought physicians were leading these organizations, had no idea that it was 5 or 6% of healthcare systems and hospitals that have a physician CEO. Mm-hmm. So I think that is an important point.
I have a story there. So, I was, as you said, I was on the Permanente Medical Group leadership team. And then this crazy door opened, and I think I was probably the third in KP's history nationally to go from the medical group to the health plan in a leadership role, which is kind of crazy to believe. Back to, people think that we're running these places. We're not. And I remember in the early days of doing that, I thought, gosh, what are the transferable skills that you learned in the care of patients that are going to serve you well in this new role as the Vice President of Government External Relations and then eventually research for the health plan? And I said, well, what did your patients want? And I told them, this is a conversation I had with myself. What did your patients want? I said, well, they assumed you knew your stuff. So you got to know your stuff. You have to have the ability to instantly establish trusting relationships, because often you're meeting strangers, right? You had to follow through. You had to do what you said you were going to do. High degree of integrity. And you had to treat them as if they would make them feel like they were their only one. That was one of the best compliments I'd get from patients who would say, she treats me like I'm her only patient. It may for some long waits in the waiting room, but there you have it. And then the last one, which was probably the most important, is then they wanted to know, regardless of whether the news was good, bad, or in between, that you weren't going to abandon them, that you weren't going to leave them. And then I said, don't you think that's what every business partner, every nonprofit, every community group, every employee that you're going to work with, don't you think those are the things that they want? I said, yeah. I said, then you'll be okay, because you can learn the rest. You can learn the rest, and that which you can. And remember, you don't have to play all the roles anyway, because you can't realistically. So, there is this, there's such, in terms of our skill sets, so much that is transferable to leading and serving. And I think that it's both leading and serving organizations if we are mindful about it and do a little bit of reflecting. And by the way, look at those 5 things, because you're probably not grand at every single one of them, so that you know where you might have to kind of dig in a little bit more as you make these transitions. And this is how I look at it. We're there to inspire, and I don't mean in hokey, hollow, shallow ways. We're there to set vision and help people create those visions, co-create vision and direction, to remove barriers. So we really do need to know the business. You do need to know how things work. You got to understand how money comes in. In my view, you have to be as committed to the margin as you are to the mission, because the two become a virtuous cycle if you do it well together. So you're there to remove barriers, to support. And the most important thing we do is where I think we've all got work to do. And I will admit, even I have work to do. That sounded funny. I have work to do. Is we're there to grow the next generation of leaders, because we're not going to be in these roles forever.
Wow. Well, Jandel, I'm just looking at the time. I think that we need to wrap up. I so appreciate the time that we've had. And I'd like to plant a little seed that we might circle back and expand this conversation, go a few other directions with a later podcast. So what do you think of that possibility?
If I can be helpful, if through this, and Patty, I am so grateful for the opportunity. And then back to where we started, the Tylenol is still working, so I'm feeling good. If this has been useful or helpful in some way to some doc who's wondered, can I or should I, then I'd say our work is done here for the moment. And I would welcome the opportunity to share more if I can be useful or helpful. Seriously. So
super. Well, thank you so much, Jandel.
Oh, thank you. This was fun. This was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the License to Lead podcast. Be sure to visit licensed2leadpodcast.com to join the conversation, access the show notes, and sign up for our newsletter. Leave us a message with your provocative question or your thoughtful comments. You might inspire a future episode of the License to Lead podcast. Thanks so much, everyone.